Thank you.
Quite simply, Jancis is one of the most respected wine writers and wine critics in the world today. She's been writing about wine for more than 40 years. She writes daily for her website, jancisrobinson.com. She's the FT's wine correspondent and has written more than 20 books about wine. In 1984, she was the first person outside of the wine trade to become a master of wine, which is quite a tough thing to do. And she sits on the Royal Household Wine Committee, where she chooses wine for the Queen. And she was also awarded an OBE for her services to the wine industry.
That's brilliant.
That's just a brief summary.
But it's accurate, which is amazing.
And today, she's here to talk about her latest book, which is The 24-Hour Wine Expert, and also an online course on a platform called Udemy around mastering wine. Oh yes, so you'll find details on a little green slip on your seats. So, you started your career writing for the wine trade, so magazines like Wine and Spirit, and you've written many books that are like a Bible or encyclopedias of the wine world, such as Oxford Companion to Wine or Wine Grapes. Can you tell us about the journey from that to this, which is quite a beginner's guide to wine?
Sure. Well, the 24-Hour Wine Expert came about really via our 24-year-old daughter, Rose. She was between jobs and she was fed up with all her friends who had masses of questions about wine and kept saying to her, "Your mother's a wine writer, you must know the answer." And so she decided that she would write a guide to wine for her age group. And she went about it in a very sensible way, which was to have a kind of focus group for all her friends, well lubricated by my wine tasting leftovers, and wrote and said to them, what would you want in a guide to wine? And made a record of all the questions they had and the topics that they wanted to have covered. And then she was offered a nice job on Vogue, so she didn't, she's now at Refinery 29, and so she abandoned the idea. But I'm from the north of England, so I don't like waste. And I decided, so that was one reason that I did it. The other reason, but you're filming this, aren't you? So I've got to be a bit tactful. The other reason is that a contemporary Dutch wine writer that I know had written a book in Holland that was a big success there called Wine Expert in a Weekend. And he was very keen that there would be an English version of it and that we would do this together. And I was far too busy doing the Oxford Companion to Wine for the fourth edition came out last year to sort of really take it on board. And he kept nagging me. Finally, I read his book, or English translation of it, and I didn't think it was quite right. It was sort of aimed at quite a middle-aged to elderly couple. And he told them, go into this store and buy that and then do that. And but by this stage, he was really in the heavy nagging, so I sort of had to do something. And so I decided that I would do it completely from scratch, my way. But I have to acknowledge that he was the one who nagged me into it. So it's a kind of two-pronged attack.
Oh, big thanks to him.
Yes, I suppose.
And what sort of an audience did you have in mind?
Very well. Sometimes some of my wine geeky friends say, "How did you manage to get the whole of the sort of million-word Oxford Companion to Wine into that little book?" It's not the idea at all. It's got nothing to do with my great big reference books. It's for people who really like to drink wine and want and want a shortcut to the essentials of wine, not wine geeks. If people want to get further into it, that's fine. There's no shortage of other sources of material. But this is just the essentials and the most common things, I think, the practical things that people want to know. So it does lean heavily on Rose's list. And it's never produced a book that's as cheap as that. $4.99. It's ridiculous. It is coming out in America in the American publisher in September. The American publishers are putting it hardback on it, which seems a bit weird to me. But
it's so thin.
yeah, it's just it really does fit into a pocket or a bag or whatever. Yeah.
Well, I've done the course online.
The online one.
The online course. And I really loved that it was just a practical guide. And I will say that it was also a great way for me to clarify all the silly questions that I had in my head. And, you know, I'm not quite brave enough to ask other people, but you certainly answered them for me. So I thought maybe we could go into like a myth-busting game for wine. So these are some of the things that you taught me on the course. So let's start with number one, which is tasting wine. So you go into a restaurant and you get a little sample to taste. The purpose of that is so I can see if I actually like the wine or not.
That is definitely not the reason. You are not allowed to send a wine back just because you don't like it. The purpose of that giving you a taste is twofold, for you to check two things. Well, first of all, they show you the bottle. If it's a decent place, they should. And they should show it to you with the label fully exposed so you can check the name of the wine and the vintage and that they're always the same. And it's amazing how often they give you another vintage because,
really?
It's the next one on or something. And it's not always worse, but it's amazing how inaccurate some wine lists are. So you're checking that it's what you ordered. You're checking, you hope that they should open it in front of you. So, because there have been instances of people ordering very expensive bottles, and then the bottle is brought to you already opened. And in an old-fashioned, unscrupulous place, sometimes they would put an inferior wine in that bottle. You take a smell of it. And you're just checking that it's not at all mouldy, that it's fresh and fruity. Because if it's stoppered with a natural cork, sometimes, in about 3% of cases sometimes, it will have a cork taint. It will have been tainted by a mouldy cork. And if it's a really bad case, it will smell unappetizing and mouldy, and you just won't want to drink it. Trouble is that cork taint comes in degrees, and you can get a mild cork tainted wine, which possibly only the winemaker would know was tainted. You will have a mouthful of it and say, it's not very fruity, it's not great, but hasn't got an obvious fault. So you have to be a real confident professional to send back a bottle that's got a mild cork taint, and you've really got to know how the wine should taste. But basically it's to check that it hasn't got a really bad cork taint. And then it's also to check, which you can do either by having a mouthful. A cork taint should be perceptible just on the nose, as we say. But if you have a mouthful, then or feel the glass, you can check whether the wine's at the right temperature, because wine is amazingly sensitive to temperature. We can come on to that a bit later. And if very, very often in a restaurant they serve red wines too warm because they've read that red wine should be served warmer than white. And if a wine gets too warm, even a red wine, it loses its refreshment factor. It's sort of heavy and soupy. And very, very often we ask for an ice bucket, actually, for a red wine, especially if it's in a place where they've been keeping the red wine above the bar or next to the kitchen or something. Or if it's a white wine, they often chill it very, very fiercely because they've read that white wine should be chilled. And if something is too cold, whatever it is, you can't actually smell anything. So if they're serving you a white wine and it's too cold, then just say, please don't put it in an ice bucket, leave it on the table, that kind of thing. So that's what you're checking. But you're not allowed just to say, nah, I don't like this, because they've opened it. Yes. And I'm saying this because my husband was a restaurateur, our son is now a restaurateur, so I have a slight, they'll be out of pocket if you just send it back.
Okay, another one. I'm looking at a wine list, and I'd been told in the past that, well, you don't want to choose the cheapest one. you don't want to choose the most expensive one. Like, choose the second least expensive bottle of wine.
That's a sort of an urban myth, or it's a very common myth, that the cleverest choice is the second cheapest. And all restaurateurs know that. So they put the wine with the highest profit margin second on the list. So it's not clever to choose the second.
So what
What
should we
is
do?
clever
Yes.
is, and especially nowadays, when we have so many wine and waiting staff who are enthusiastic about wine, and quite a lot of heavily trained wine enthusiasts as wine waiters or just restaurant staff, ask their advice. I do. I'm probably the person in London who asks more advice from sommeliers than anybody. There's almost an inverse rule that almost the more you know about wine, the less embarrassed you are about asking about it. And the less you know, you think, oh, I don't want to show up my ignorance, so, oh, I see that name on there, oh, I've heard of Chablis, yeah, I'll go for that. Whereas the wine professionals will look down a wine list and go, I know that. Oh, I've never heard of this Ecuadorian lesser spotted thing. I'll ask for that. See? But then you would say to the waiter, have you tasted this? What's it like? Or
Yes.
or you spot something else. Is that too old? Or is it? So they want to share their knowledge. In the old days, wine used to be served by underpaid elderly wait staff, often not speaking very good English, whose kind of defense mechanism was to be snooty and didn't really know very much. And it was a waste of time asking them for advice. But now, the wait staff are much more likely to be young, enthusiastic and knowledgeable, and would love to discuss your wine choices with
And
them.
I personally graduated from saying, can you recommend a red,
Yeah.
to saying, I really like Pinots.
That's the best thing, yeah. The first question of a good somm will be, what do you like, what do you normally like drinking? And don't be ashamed of saying, I don't want to spend more than X. And that just helps them.
Okay. One last one, which is all wine gets better with age.
That's definitely wrong. By volume, probably about 95% of the wine sold in this country does not get better with age.
Wow.
It's put on, I'm talking volume here, not by the number of listings or anything like that, but the big sellers are mass market bottles that are put on the supermarket shelf straight from the bottling line. Their stock in trade is youthful fruitiness, and they're not made to last. So drink them whatever colour, even reds. No point in cellaring most of them. One great variety that can age reasonably well, two that I think of. Riesling among whites, no hurry to drink that generally, and Cabernet Sauvignon among reds, that will last reasonably well. But the commercial stuff, don't age it. But most of the wines that I write about are designed to age, do improve with age, but I have to admit that by volume, they're the top 5% of interest to me, and I hope my readers. But Blossom Hill is not very interesting to write about. So.
So you taste how many?
I think it's about 10,000 wines a year.
Wow. Okay, so you're definitely the right person to answer this question. What regions or what regions do you think are underrated today in terms of quality and or value? Maybe you can tell us about a white and a red.
Well, to get value, go for unfashionable wines.
Okay.
And it's just starting to catch up, but only just, so it's still great value. Muscadet had a sort of period out in the wilderness where it was thought of as having no character, and it's having a wonderful renaissance at the moment, and it's had a couple of nice vintages. 12 was a great vintage, 14, 15 good vintages. And it lasts, it ages. It's made from a grape which is a cousin of Chardonnay. And it's serious wine, it's just that it hasn't got a serious reputation. So Muscadet is one. In fact, so low are the prices that Muscadet farmers are sort of going out of business all the time. So they need you. Please support them. And the wines are not expensive. Beaujolais is the sort of red wine equivalent of Muscadet. After the success of Beaujolais Nouveau, we all fell out of love with Beaujolais. But nowadays, they're not making it as a Nouveau sort of accelerated style. They're making it as proper red wine, still not expensive. So those are obvious French bargains. What people don't generally realise is that Bordeaux makes most of the most expensive red wines in the world, but it makes so much wine that there is brilliant value at the bottom. You know, what they call petit chateaux, sort of little properties that aren't famous ones. I mean, I have a wine of the week on the website every Friday, and I had one the other day. It was the wine from the Wine Society, which is a great place to buy wine because it's a cooperative. They're not in the market to make money. And they had a 2009 Medoc for under £10 a bottle that was just gorgeous because 2009 was a very ripe vintage, so it's drinking beautifully now. So that's France. South African wine generally is underpriced, and I think that although South Africans think they're better at making reds than whites, I think they're better than making whites than reds, and because they get that cold current up from the South Pole, they're good at keeping natural freshness in the wines. So I think South African whites are very good. And actually Chile is very good value. There's a lot of rather boring, particularly red wine from Chile, but it's very dependable. You know, if you're in a travel lodge kind of, somewhere you don't want to be with a not very good wine list, then Chile would be probably the most reliable choice.
Wow. Thank you. So recently, Decanter, the magazine, published some articles, or there was a lot of press about a blind taste test of, I think, 16,000 bottles, and the winner was Asda, the supermarket wine, and it was a Malbec, retailing at £4.37.
Well, the winner was Asda's PR department, rather than the wine, really. They put the most amazing spin on, this wine. I think it normally retails at £6.99, and when they did the publicity, they'd put it on special promotion. And it did, apparently, I'm not involved with the Decanter World Wine Awards. Magazines nowadays are finding it very, very difficult to make money because subscriptions and ad revenues are down. Don't need to tell you this. But one good money spinner is to organise competitions, and because they charge quite a lot to enter. And so every year they organise the Decanter World Wine Awards, and yes, there were a lot of entries. But this Asda wine didn't come top of the whole thing. It won, one section.
But
I haven't tasted it, though.
You haven't tasted it.
But the corollary of that is something which I actually say very explicitly in the book. There is no direct relationship between price and quality with wine. Yeah. There are lots of overpriced wines, a few underpriced ones that we've just mentioned, well, again, I don't have to tell you, every marketing department needs its segmentation and its icon wine, and then its premium wine, and they put the prices up, not always, in my view, because the wine is better at the top. It's more, they've spent more on, they put it into more new oak, say, which increases the production costs. But I very often, when tasting a range of wines, find myself preferring my favourite wine isn't necessarily the most expensive. It's often it's been the most tarted up, but not necessarily the nicest to drink.
When we're out in the supermarket or our favourite independent wine merchant, I guess there must be some kind of a minimum price level, though.
Yeah.
Can you make, for example, what's your opinion on supermarket wines in general?
Well, when in the 70s, in the 80s in particular, British supermarkets were highly competitive wine departments, and they saw wine as a major way to bring footfall, encourage footfall, and they put a lot of effort into optimizing the quality of what was in the bottle. But in recent years, not least because we went through a period when every year the duty went up, but it was on a kind of rolling thing, a sort of multiplier. So George Osborne could get up, announce the budget and say, as for wine duty, no change. No change meant the same old multiplier, the same old percentage increase. So the public didn't understand that duty was going up. And so the supermarkets just had to absorb the extra costs, which meant that one of the reasons, or there are several others, that the quality went down and down. Also, they don't have as much pride now. The wine buying teams, in general, are sort of very much inferior to the accountant. So I'm not nearly as excited by the supermarket ranges as at one stage I was. And I'm a big champion of the mushrooming number of independent wine retailers. Of course, they can't buy in bulk. They can't give you a $4.99 bottle that you could even think of enjoying. Probably the minimum for something I think it would be probably £7. Start at £7, really £6.99, and that sweet spot for when you're not paying over the odds and you're sort of, with any luck, getting what you pay for is sort of between £7 and £17, something like that, and you're really getting what you pay for.
Still quite reasonable, I guess.
Yeah,
£7
yeah,
isn't bad.
yeah. And a good independent wine store should be really, there's so much inexpensive wine around, they should be choosing what they're offering at the lowest end carefully, yeah.
So as I've learned to taste properly, one of my challenges is, so there's sight, smell, taste. The last two steps, and in particular, flavor descriptors, is something that I find quite amusing because I read descriptions and I'm just unable to quite, get there. And then you read descriptions that are frankly ridiculous. Like in that documentary Somm, they talk about, what is it, a freshly cut garden hose. I don't know, I've never smelled something like that before.
No,
so how do you train?
Yeah, how do you train? Well, do you want to? Do you need to?
I guess so.
All right. Well, obviously, it does help to remember flavours. It helps to attach words to them.
Yes.
But I would say just follow what it reminds you of. I mean, I don't think there's no point in me saying, I could say this reminds me of X and Y, but I would, because we've all got different tasting equipment hidden inside and different preferences and different intolerances and things we can't sense and things we are particularly sensitive to, you're going to experience something different. So I would just try to concentrate on, I've given in here sort of what my common descriptors of various grapes are as what might be a help. But, if there's something that strikes you, then try and remember it and look for it again.
Yeah.
But I'm slightly skeptical about these tasting notes where people, and they exist, where people list 20 different unrelated flavors or aromas in a wine. Sometimes it just seems as though I find it different. I have never tasted 20 different things in a wine, and I've tasted some fantastic wine. And I believe that physiologists say it's pretty impossible to sense more than 3 or 4 things in one substance.
So I have hope.
Yes, definitely.
Top 3 tips. So from this book, there are many tips.
Well, I think the first thing is to follow your own likes and dislikes. There is no such thing as rights and wrongs in wine appreciation. It is just important to discover what you like and to follow that. It is not wrong to hate all red wines. Most inconveniently, both of our daughters only like white wine, which is a pain because 80% of the wine that I taste, and I'm sent a heck of a lot of free samples, is red. And, you know, I'd love to give it to them. And some people have intolerances to red wine or white wine and sort of thing. The second thing is, if you do want to maximize your enjoyment of wine and learn a bit more, I know I should say buy my book, buy my course, or look at my website. In fact, there's a lot that's free on jancisrobinson.com. About a third of it is free, including a lot of sort of basics of wine. But I think the most useful thing to do practically is to identify a local independent wine merchant and try to establish a relationship with them, a bit like you would with a bookseller. I think there are strong parallels between wine shops and booksellers. And you know how you'd go into a bookseller and say, I really enjoyed this book, what would you recommend? So go say, this is, I really like Pinot Noir, not so sure about California ones, but I'd like, yeah. What would you recommend? And allow them to lead you on. It's in their interests to give you good advice. If they don't, then try another store. But in London, we're spoiled for choice, and that, I think, is, and they love talking about it just the same way as the wine waiters do. So capitalize on that, and that's two, isn't it? Tips. I think also don't underestimate the importance of temperature. A lot of reds taste nicer if they're reasonably cool, you know.
What's the right temperature?
Well, not a hot room. Sort of cool, straight from a cellar, sort of thing. I know I ought to say.
18?
I mean, but you're not going to go around
Yeah,
sticking
exactly.
a thermometer in, are you? Yeah, about 17. Yeah.
I might. No.
Yeah, about 17. But sometimes down to 15. You know, and it's only really champagne and things that you want to be really cool down to sort of 10, 11, that kind of thing. And the fuller bodied the white, the warmer you can serve it to encourage the smells and the flavour.
Thank you. Old world versus new world. So that sort of elitist attitude that exists, particularly maybe in Bordeaux or Burgundy. It feels that the playing field is a lot more level now than it was years ago.
Well, as I was saying, my FT article tomorrow is about, this year is the 40th anniversary of the tasting that sort of turned the world of wine upside down. It was in Paris, and it was called The Judgment of Paris. And a friend of mine, Stephen Spurrier, got a whole load of France's top tasters together. He wanted to show them these wines that he'd found in California that were really good. But at the last minute, he realized none of them had tasted California wine before, and they might be prejudiced if they knew. So he decided that he would organize a blind tasting, mixing them up with some of France's most revered wines. And guess what? They all preferred the California ones. This was in 1976. They were absolutely hot. They didn't believe it. They thought it was a fluke result. They said, oh, it's because French wines need longer to mature. And so he organized it again 10 years later, and Californians won again. So that showed slowly, because the old world was slow to accept it, that New World wine could be really very good. And all sorts of other developments. The Australians had masses of very highly trained winemakers, and they swept through Europe, particularly the sort of under-resourced cooperative cellars, teaching the gospel of winery hygiene and how to keep the fruit in wine. So they upped the quality of inexpensive old world wine quite substantially. And old world producers, their children, the people who are now in charge, would routinely have a stint in a New World, at least one, if not several, New World regions. So, but at the same time, New World wine producers got rather taken by this notion of terroir and started to get fascinated about how little local features actually influence what's in the bottle. So the result of all that has been a massive drawing together, really, of old world producers being much more technically qualified and having friends throughout the new world and accepting that the new world makes good wine, and new worlders actually wanting their wines to be more than just technically perfect, but to absorb some of the best of the old world, and are rather envious of all the tradition. So it's not really a battle anymore, taking the best of both worlds.
So in the future, let's say 20 years out, no real difference. It's very much about region and producer, do you think?
It's all about specifics and local, yes, nowadays. Yeah.
So one of the things that has helped me learn about wine is the associations that you make in the book. So if I like white burgundies,
yes, then
what would I? So
yeah,
maybe you can suggest a few. So let's say I like white burgundies, but they're really expensive.
Yeah.
What are my alternative choices?
Okay, well, the obvious thing is to go for Chardonnay, which is the same grape, and places that are making wines really quite like white burgundy. Australia, which used to make these great big fat sort of Bridget Jones type wines, has done a complete volte-face and is now making very good copies of white burgundy. In fact, sometimes almost too austere. So that would be an obvious place. Also, South Africa is making very good Chardonnay, as I said, well priced. And even Chile's got some good Chardonnay. And there's been a sea change in California whereby they're making more and more. They've still got some quite big fat Chardonnays in California, but some more Burgundian ones as well. But they're quite expensive. California wine's quite expensive.
So let's shift gears a bit. Googlers are a techie bunch.
Yeah.
And there's been an explosion of wine apps and websites. Do you think there's a place for technology in the wine world?
Oh yeah, well, you
should
just got to look around. Everyone's using the sort of label scanning apps, and it's had a huge effect on us wine writers. There was a time, not that long ago, when there were really just a handful of wine authorities around the world, and they'd sit on a pedestal and hand down their judgments, on tablets of stone and with scores, and everybody would follow them slavishly and stuff. Not anymore, which actually is very healthy. I used to say what I wanted to do in my working life was not tell people what to like, but give people enough information that they had the confidence to make up their own minds. And that is happening at a massive rate. And now that you can share pictures of what you're drinking, and people are getting recommendations from a much wider range of recommenders, whether it's friends, somms, the odd wine writer, it's all much more democratic. I wrote the review section, it's called Life and Arts, of the Financial Times on a Saturday. I think it was only last September when the new Oxford Companion came out. I wrote a piece called something like What Future for Expertise. It's on my website as well. And it was a very, very popular article because I think it was maybe one of the few from somebody who'd sort of made a reputation in a field, addressing what it's like to exist in a new landscape. And it was interesting.
Do you have any favourites?
Favourite?
Whether it be websites or apps?
Of course I've got a favourite website.
Apart from yours.
No, apart from I don't use label scanning apps because, it's my life. I kind of, I think, well, my favourite, the site I use the most, but maybe it's semi-professionally, but it's hugely useful for any consumer, is winesearcher.com, which is the price comparison. There's only one good wine price comparison site, winesearcher.com. And funnily enough, it's based in New Zealand, actually. It was set up by a guy who built Berry Brothers' website for them and then went back to his native New Zealand. And it is, honestly, it can save you a fortune. And it's also very interesting because you see the variation in prices in different markets and things like that. And the retailers have to join, so it doesn't list every single retailer, but it lists a heck of a lot of them. very good. And it gives you, you know, the average price throughout the world, and you can search by market and by country, and in the US you can search by state, and it's very good.
Okay. So continuing with the futuristic theme, let's talk trends. So these days you hear a lot about organic, natural, biodynamic wines. Can you demystify what it all means, please?
Well, organic, you know, is quite straightforward, minimizing agrochemicals, and I don't think I could tell blind an organic wine versus a conventionally made wine. Biodynamic sounds very weird. It's done, the operations are done according to the phases of the moon, and it involves sort of tisane and little sort of homeopathic doses of sort of chamomile buried in a corner of a vineyard in a cow horn. Does sound, honestly, and it sounds completely crazy. And no one has managed to advance any scientific explanation or reason. However, an awful lot of very, very good wine producers have adopted biodynamic viticulture because it does seem to result in vines and soil that look so much healthier and produce wines that very often in a blind tasting, sometimes I will think, I think that's biodynamic. They have a sort of extra vitality to them. I know this sounds a bit weird, but it could be that to obey biodynamic strictures, you have to pay such a lot of attention to each individual vine that is the consequence. And it may not matter that you're not following the things of the moon. That said, I mean, Burgundy is probably the most traditional wine region, and even everyone in the younger generation knows that when the moon is in a certain position, the lees will be all stirred up in the barrel, so don't do your bottling then, and you wait until the moon is in the right phase to do your bottling, and that's just something they've observed.
And natural?
Natural, glad, yes. Natural's very trendy, as you know. Natural means you haven't really added anything, and you glory in not adding anything, which is great. The only trouble in my book is that it doesn't always result in a good wine. For me personally, it's not enough that the wine is natural. First of all, it's got to be good. If it can be good and natural, that's fine. But there are still, although the overall quality of natural wine has been increasing, there are still, to me, a lot of faulty natural wines that taste like cider gone off, or there's a particular compound which apparently only about a third of the population are sensitive to, and I can only assume that the naturalistas are not sensitive to it. It's sort of how you would imagine an old rodent cage smelling. And some of the wines are like that. So you've got to be a bit careful, I think. But that said, there's a great movement throughout the world now for a new generation wanting to make not just copies of the old classics, but new sorts of wine. And a lot of those are natural. So I think it's great that they exist. I think on a list, it helps to have them separated out so you know what you're getting. So for instance, our son puts them on the list under off-piste wines, so you know that they're different. Although funnily enough, I was just this morning, before coming here, I was reading through a transcript of an interview that a Polish wine writer had done with me, and he had written out, because I'd said he'd had the same question, so I explained about off-piste wines, and he'd written off-piste as OFF-PISSED.
I could ask you many questions, but maybe Google's in the room would like to ask some questions, so please don't be shy.
Any
questions? Whoa. you.
I don't think you need a mic for
that.
I
don't know if I need a mic either, but
perhaps
just in case
for filming purposes.
Oh yes,
sorry.
Yeah.
So I feel like I've done many kind of wine 101s, but I find kind of the next step quite scary. So either do you pick a country? Do you learn about a country? Do you learn about a specific region? What about vintages? So what do you recommend for sort of 201 in terms of learning wine?
Do you know the WSET? Wine and Spirit Education Trust is I did all their courses when I first started, and it's the things that lead up to the Master of Wine. They're based in London, although they're global now. They're the world's biggest wine educating body, and they have a series of scaled courses, and a lot of them are evening. So I would look into those. On our website, under the Learn section, we have something called Courses. We've got a long list of wine educators all around the world, quite a lot in London. I think, what I like about WSET is it's very, they force you to learn everything. You know, you can't just follow what happens to take your fancy. There's another good guy called Michael Schuster who gives regular wine courses in Islington, actually. But have a look at a list there. Christie's do wine courses, but they tend to be a little bit, you know, just very, very fine wines, really, and they tend to assume a bit of knowledge, I think.
How did you get into the wine writing? How did you transition from Oxford mathematics and philosophy into doing this?
Well, when I graduated, it was way back in '71, when the subjects of wine and food were thought of as being terminally frivolous. So although I knew that I was most interested in wine and food even then, didn't dare say to my friends I was going into either of those, because they'd have said, what a waste of an Oxford education. So I spent 3 years in the travel business because I liked travel. Then I dropped out to France for a year in Provence, and surrounded by vineyards. And by that stage, of course, I was surrounded by people for whom eating and drinking is what life's all about in France. And so I was determined that when I got back to London, I would find a job in either wine or food. And as a little tangent, my husband, the restaurateur, I used to be a cook quite a bit, but by the time we had 2 children in '84, my husband, who at first couldn't cook at all, but having a restaurant, got fascinated by it, sort of said, "Stand aside, madam, I will now do all the cooking," and has done all the cooking in our household ever since. In one of our son's restaurants last week, well, he basically sent round an email to the family saying, "Hey, you'll never guess what. This guy came in and said that he interviewed Mum to be a cook in his wine bar." and Rose then responded by that saying, "Was it a tart tatin focused wine bar? Because that's the one dish that I cook." But I was at that stage looking at food as well as wine, but I found this job as assistant editor of a wine trade magazine at a dramatic reduction in pay. But I learnt on the job. I immediately signed up for the WSET courses so that I did actually have some. When I was interviewed, the publisher said, we had quite a lot of applicants to this job. We're having quite a bit of difficulty choosing the right person, because either we choose a wine expert and have to teach them how to write, or we choose a journalist and have to teach them all about wine. He looked down at my application and he said, "You, of course, are neither of these things." Nevertheless, you're the favourite for the job. And afterwards, when I quizzed him, he said it was because I'd shown that I could organise the skiing side of Thomson Holidays, and that I would organise what I didn't know, I would organise myself. And I had done I'd been the restaurant correspondent of ISIS when I was at university and things like that. So I'd written for the Good Food Guide. So I think he knew I wasn't total illiterate. And then it just went nicely from there. It was a great timing, because I started in the end of '75, just as the British were kind of getting into wine and travel.
What impact do you think Brexit will have on our beloved wine? Sorry.
Sorry, no, I'm not groaning at you. Well, prices will go up. All wine prices will go up. A few of the more savvy wine importers bought currency forward, but they're going to go up eventually. One short-term effect was that London is a centre for fine wine trading throughout the world. We are an absolute Asia is catching up. But and as soon as we voted, the fine wine traders here were, they're cleared out of, well, as the pound plummeted, or rather, cleared out of stock. The fine wine traders are now desperate for stock, busy calling around all their customers saying, now's the time to sell, we'll buy your, your wine collection from you, because they don't want to have to go into Europe. And a lot of French Bordeaux negociants were plundering the collections of British fine wine traders. Not good. No. Oh, I did think of one good thing though. The EU has a fund to promote EU wine in non-EU countries. So
I'm a big fan of your writing, and I actually did a few courses with Richard Hemming, who I
Oh,
think
right.
works with you, so
Good.
big fan and really great. And I recommend him actually. If you can get him to do courses, he's excellent.
Well, I don't even know where does he give his courses? He
I don't know,
works for me, but I don't
it was
know.
something organised through the, I think there was the London Wine
That's
Association or something.
London. Yeah.
LWA or something.
Yes, it'll be
Academy.
on that list
very
anyway,
good.
on the website.
And
And he's very nice, very easy.
super nice.
Kind of, yeah.
I'm a big. I buy most of my wines through the Wine Society. I really like it.
Yeah.
Is there like people start? I don't have any space for a cellar, but I suppose I could buy a bit more wine.
Well,
what do you think
the
about?
best value place to store wine is at the Wine Society.
So, and what I was going to ask is, what is the value of doing that? Of building up, let's say, a stock of a few hundred bottles, like nothing crazy, but does it make sense?
Yeah.
I mean, are you saving money, or are you just kind of just tying up money and stuff that you're not going to save
Yeah.
on later?
Usually you're saving money. I mean, the vintages, the 09 and 10 in Bordeaux were exceptions, which the Bordelais were desperate to get as much money out of the Chinese as possible, and they overpriced the wines. Britain is not a very good place to buy mature wine by the single bottle in. You can generally buy it by the dozen bottles, but so if you want to get your hands on wine drink wine when it's fully mature, then it probably is a good idea to lay it down, as they say. Yeah.
It's cheaper than buying a sports car.
It's a lot cheaper than buying a sports car, much cheaper, and it's sociable. You can share it with your friends more, more friends than a sports car.
Do you think climate change is going to have an impact on which region are interested?
It's already having quite a massive impact, and in fact, one of the approx 3,000 free articles on my website I published quite recently was specifically which regions have been most affected and what have been the most obvious effects in the world of wine. One of the more obvious ones is the poleward expansion of the wine regions of the world. There's not too much further south the southern hemisphere wine regions can go before toppling into the ocean. But countries that now have thriving wine industries include Denmark, Sweden, Holland, Belgium, England, and there's even a vineyard in Norway now, which has yet to ripen a crop successfully, but it has been planted. So that's very obvious. Alcohol levels going up generally because of more hotter summers. And say somewhere like, and then places running out of water, terrible water shortages at times in California, and particularly the inland areas of Australia. Quite a lot of grape farmers have given up in those inland irrigated areas because it's just too expensive to buy the water rights. And there's also been a problem with salinity, sort of to get good quality water is too much of a challenge. And so in general, in established wine regions, there's a move for people to find cooler areas. You see that in Burgundy, for instance.
So in Oxford, they're kind of notorious that the colleges have like wine cellars. Have you ever been around them? And which one has like the best wine collection?
Yes, the best one is All Souls, which has no undergraduates at all. And I have been around that one, and it is amazing. I haven't been. I mean, actually, I went round to write an article for Wine and Spirit, which I left in 1980. So I'm not at all up to speed. But we made a television programme about the cellars at Lincoln, actually. And it, like lots of the Oxbridge cellars, has sold off a lot of vintage port. They used to, serve a lot of vintage port, but don't anymore. But as I understand it, the job of wine steward at the Oxbridge colleges is highly sought after, and there's massive backstabbing to get it.
Wow.
Because then there are lots and lots of tastings in Oxbridge. The merchants, that's one of the places where you can sell fine wine. So it is Oxbridge is a good place to taste wine, and certainly that was where I was introduced to fine wine and had my seminal bottle of red Burgundy, which made me realise just how good wine could be.
Quick question from a marketing perspective. Are there any tricks that you have that you'd use to make a wine seem like it tastes better? And I guess there's a certain sort of amount of ceremony that can influence how people perceive taste. And I don't know whether that's something that you address at all, and the sort of things that you do to help anticipation of a taste, and anticipation is something that actually does improve a taste.
Well, most of the time, I'm judging wine, and so I have no interest in making. I want it as it is. I'm almost looking for faults. I'm analysing it. There's a huge difference between tasting and drinking, and tasting is what I do during the day, and I want to minimise the effects of alcohol, and I spit everything out, and I'm super critical. But in the evening is drink time, and that's a completely different activity, and you're right, I want to make the wine taste as good as possible, particularly when I'm serving wine to friends. One very useful trick is that if you have a young red wine, which is still high in tannins, these sort of chewy things that will preserve it for quite a long time, but in youth they can be quite astringent and obvious. The warmer you serve it, the less obvious the tannins will be. So that would be, say, a young red Bordeaux or young Cabernet. Serve it just a little bit warmer than you would serve an old wine, and it'll taste softer. And if you actually have it with a dish which is itself chewy, like a steak or a roast or something like that, the wine will seem less chewy. And so those would be good tips for flattering a young red wine. Wine is pretty, unless it's a really sweet wine is pretty wrecked by sweet food. I mean, I look at people, just the other night, I was amazed to see people ordering another glass of wine as the pudding arrived. And I thought, well, that's not going to taste of anything. So just be careful about serving wine with anything very sweet. And I suppose things that are very, very acid sometimes are tricky partners for wine. And remember what I said about temperature generally before. That can help.
Just a question around like white wine and fish and red wine and meat. And like, do you like have a rule of when do you actually have white wine with meat or?
No. If it's a very, very simple, poached sole, I mean, very delicate, say, then yes, to have a great big massive chewy red wine wouldn't be a great match, but a Pinot Noir, sort of light fruity red, absolutely fine. It's more about the colour, less about the colour, more about the dimensions of a wine, really. A great big, if you're having a rich stew, then have a kind of big, powerful wine, and a delicate food, then have a delicate wine sort of thing. But the colour doesn't matter. And Bordeaux, they make largely red wine, and they're always serving fish with the red wine. But in general, a fruity red is better than a chewy red with fish, so Pinot Noir would be a good choice.
I have a less technical question.
No.
Does the Queen have a favourite wine?
No.
No. How often do you get asked this question? All the time?
Especially abroad. Yeah. No, I don't think she's a big wine fan.
Oh.
But she needs a lot of wine for all those receptions and things. But because it all comes out of the privy purse, we know we can't afford. We don't go for very expensive things for big receptions, because we know the Daily Mail would get hold of it. But it is fun to walk in to Buckingham Palace. I still get a sort of childish thrill for kind of showing my driver's license to the policeman on the gates and then crunching over the gravel.
One last question for me. So we touched on English wines, and there's a thriving sparkling wine industry. Do you have any favorite producers?
Yes, I do, and quite a few actually. And again, they are. I put them at the end of an FT article, so they're at the end of a free article on jancisrobinson.com. If you put English wine in the search box, choose not tasting notes but everything else. I listed about 12, but one very good one, Hambledon, is very good. Came top of a blind tasting I did with champagnes. Beating the champagne.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.